When we talk about Esther, one of the most profound pieces of information and one of the most important and possibly painful pieces of information that the Talmudists tell us is in a discussion that they have when they talk about Esther's status as the wife of Ahasuerus. Esther, just to brush up on the story, became queen to Ahasuerus, who was a despot, when he killed his first wife, Vashti. So Ahasuerus partied hard, didn't really care about life, and after commanding that his wife Vashti appear before him and the guests at his party unclothed, and she refused, he had her killed. And he had her killed by the suggestion of Haman, of Haman, who of course is the primary source of evil in the story of Purim, and from whom all evil flows. Ahasuerus then is encouraged to find a new wife, and the way that he goes about doing that is by forcing all the maidens of the land to appear before him. They spend months in preparation, and then essentially Ahasuerus, for whom morality does not exist, will then go on to take each one of these maidens, and maiden does not necessarily, as we realize, mean a young person, nor does it even mean an unmarried woman, as Esther was married to Mordechai. At the point in Esther's growth where living in Mordechai's care would become halachically complicated or a halachic issue, Mordechai in fact married her. She married Mordechai and continued to live as his wife. So Ahasuerus really didn't have a care to whom he took, forced to come to join his harem. And he would take one woman, make her part of his harem, and then he would take another and another, and each of these women were then essentially discarded if he didn't find them favorable. And discarded meant that their lives were essentially over. They were discarded by Ahasuerus. They continued to live in the harem, but he never had them visit him again. The only woman who Ahasuerus wanted as a wife was this Jewish woman, Esther. He had no idea that she was Jewish. He did not know her background, nor, of course, did he care. He cared very little about anything, about any of these women. So when Esther was forcibly taken to the palace, and remember, she was the wife of Mordechai, and then forcibly taken to the harem of Ahasuerus, and then into Ahasuerus's chambers, and made to be with him, in other words, sexually, that Ahasuerus took her with no care to her will at all. The Talmud discusses Esther's status because one halachically cannot take on this type of role willingly. And so the Talmud tells us that in fact Esther never went willingly to Ahasuerus, and not only didn't she go willingly, she remained passive. She did not engage and was not a participant, even though she was forced to be with him. Now, this passivity impacted Esther's life completely. And this is not something that's difficult to understand. There was no relationship here. There was no marriage, even though Esther was forcibly married to Ahasuerus. But there was no marriage. There wasn't Esther's commitment to Ahasuerus. There was no commitment from Ahasuerus to Esther, and there was no union our sages tell us, even though he forcibly took her, there was no union because Esther remained completely passive. This impacted Esther in the biggest of ways. She was taken by force and then by choice remained passive each time Ahasuerus took her. This impacted Esther's demeanor, on top of which Esther kept her background and her religion a secret. Nobody in the palace knew that Esther was a Jew, which is quite amazing when you think about it, because that means that the entire Jewish nation, all the people who lived in Persia, also kept Esther's secret. So Esther lived a life in the palace in a state of passivity. When Haman accomplishes this decree against the Jewish people, when he convinces Ahasuerus that an act of genocide, and only an act of genocide, against the Jewish people was the right call in order to get rid of, to annihilate this people who live among us, but live differently, who don't celebrate our festivals, who have their own day of Shabbat, who don't work the same days that we do. All very good reasons for annihilation of a people, for a genocide of a people. When he got Ahasuerus to agree with him for a great sum of money, which was really what Ahasuerus was much more interested in than the people that he ruled over, Mordechai, in discovering this news, when this information became known, that Ahasuerus had agreed to the annihilation and the genocide of his people, rent his garments and dressed himself in sackcloth in a state of mourning. Mordechai had taken on a very interesting position in the palace before this. It was known that the Jewish people were wise, and Ahasuerus, in fact, had a set of advisors who were Jewish. In fact, he spoke with his advisors before he made decisions. He then would consult with his Persian advisors. So he would consult with his Jewish advisors, then he would consult with his Persian advisors. Of course, not when it came to the decision that he agreed to, which Haman had brought to him, which was the genocide of the Jewish people. Mordechai, as an advisor to the king, and because he wanted to ensure that he knew what was going on with Esther in the palace, was always within the palace gates. He was always near the court of the king. Esther sent a messenger to inquire as to what was happening with Mordechai. She had been informed that he was sitting outside the palace gates in sackcloth. And at this point in the Megillah, in the 4th chapter of the story of Esther, we read the following. And please, again, let's take a look at our handouts. Chapter 4. Mordechai knew all that had occurred. So Mordechai tore his clothes in mourning, put on sackcloth and ash. He went out into the city crying loudly and bitterly. He went up until the king's gate, for it's improper to enter the king's gate wearing sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the edict of the king and his law reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and crying and wailing. Sackcloth and ash were spread out for the masses. Esther's maids and chamberlains came in and told her about it, and the queen was terrified. She sent garments with which to dress Mordecai so that he could remove his sackcloth from upon him, but he didn't accept them. Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had placed in her service, and she commanded him to go to Mordecai to find out the meaning of this and what it was about. Hathach went out to Mordecai, to the city square that was in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all about what had happened to him and about the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the right to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the law that was proclaimed in Shushan, calling for their annihilation, to show to Esther and to tell her about it, and to instruct her to go to the king to beseech him and to plead with him on behalf of her nation. Let's remember, the king doesn't know that Esther is Jewish. Hathach went and relayed the words of Mordecai to Esther. Esther told Hathach to relay to Mordecai all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes to the king and enters the inner courtyard without being summoned, he's but one verdict. His is but one verdict, execution, except for the person to whom the king extends his golden scepter. Only that person lives. I have not been summoned to come to the king for 30 days now. They relayed Esther's words to Mordecai, and Mordecai said to relay to Esther. And these really become the defining words of Esther in the Megillah, in the story of Esther. Do not think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews by being in the king's palace. For if you will remain silent at this time, relief and salvation will come to the Jews from another source, and you and the house of your father will be lost. And who knows, said Mordecai, if it's not for just such a time that you reach this royal position. Let's take a pause here. Esther, who has created this completely placated version of herself living in the palace, who has become a person who just lies low and who does not respond to the king's advances even when he takes her. Esther, who has become the most silent of silences. Her very name speaks to the experience of silence and hiddenness. Esther, who has become completely passive, is instructed by Mordecai to go to the king. And she responds and she says, I can't. I haven't been called to the king in 30 days. And the edict is that if you haven't been called and you enter the king's room or the king's court, you'll simply be executed. So my life is in danger and I'll be useless doing this. And then Mordecai says to her, listen, God is going to save this nation. We're an eternal nation. Revach v'hatzala ya'amid laYehudim. God's going to save us. But if you don't do this now, possibly the very reason, and he doesn't say it is the reason, he just says, who knows if it's not for this reason, for this time. It's interesting that Mordecai says for this time. Esther has already been in the palace for 5 years. We read the story of Esther very quickly. It's a quick couple of chapters and the reading is done. In fact, because we fast before we read the Megillah, the reading of the Megillah is done rather rapidly on the night of the fast of Esther. So it's a really quick story, but Esther has already been in the palace living as Ahasuerus's wife for 5 years. So Mordecai says, perhaps, maybe, who knows, if it's not for just this time that you are queen to Ahasuerus. In this moment, when Mordecai says these words, when she hears these words relayed to her, it is for this time that you are in this place. Esther goes from being passive to being completely dynamic, to being completely in control of the situation. She totally takes on the role of a woman who is in exile, who knows that God depends on her right now, where she is. Because after all, what is Esther doing in the palace? Why did God put her there? What kind of a life is this for a Jewish woman? What kind of a life is it for a Jew to live in a state of exile? It's not natural. But in that moment when she is, these words of Mordecai are relayed to her. At this time, for this purpose, perhaps this is why Esther becomes different. She rises to the occasion of her purpose. And she takes on the role of Ahasuerus's wife. And she agrees to what Mordecai tells us. Let's take a look back into our handout. Let's see how Esther responds to what Mordecai tells her. When she responds to him, she says as follows, to relate to Mordecai, go and gather all the Jews who are in Shushan. Fast for my sake. Do not eat and do not drink for 3 days, night and day. My maids and I shall also fast in the same way. Then I shall go to the king, though it's unlawful. And if I perish, I perish. And the final sentence, the final statement, Mordecai then left and did all that Esther had instructed him. So here is Esther living in the palace, living with a non-Jew, as a Jewish woman, suffering. There's no question that Esther suffered, keeping her background, her life, her religion, all a secret, ensuring that she has 7 maidens and naming them by the day of the week so that she would always know when it's Shabbos. What an odd thing to do. Call your servant Sunday or Monday or Tuesday. These are her handmaidens who tended to her every day. So she kept Shabbos every week. And now 5 years in, suddenly, with all this suffering, 5 years long, she hears Mordecai's words and she realizes that her purpose can be lived. Through this suffering, she will rise to what it is that God needs of her and that the Jewish people need of her, despite the difficult situation that she is in, despite the pain, and despite the possibility of death. She will rise to her purpose. And she tells Mordecai, this is what needs to be done. So from a woman who lives a passive life in the kingdom of Ahasuerus, a vile, empty, cruel ruler, she tells Mordecai, this is what we will do. The entire nation will fast for 3 days. And Mordecai responds to her and says, but it's Pesach. These were the days before Passover and the days of the beginning of Passover. How can we fast on Passover? The Talmud tells us that Mordecai responded, sent her back a message saying, but it's Passover. You have to eat matzah on Passover. You're not allowed to fast on a holiday. And Esther responded, sent a response to him saying, Passover. If there are no Jews left, there's no festival. So for 3 days you will fast. I will fast. And then I will go to Ahasuerus. And I will plead for my people. And if he doesn't accept me and I perish, well, then I perish. So Esther went from a state of passivity to a dynamic state with complete preparedness to fulfill her mission in this world, to fulfill the potential that she was given, and to rise to her purpose, even if it meant risking her life. And indeed, this is what takes place. The entire nation fasts. Esther and her handmaidens fast. And then she approaches Ahasuerus. And because we're here, we know the rest of the story. We know that Esther was accepted by Ahasuerus, not without great trepidation on her part. In fact, our sages tell us that Esther felt herself to be clothed in divine mercy. When in the Megillah we read that she clothed herself in garments of royalty, our sages explain this to mean that she felt herself wrapped in the divine presence. But when she entered Ahasuerus's chamber, or the antechamber of the king, and there were idols, she suddenly realized that she felt suddenly empty, bereft of the divine presence, that the divine presence left her when she entered this room full of idolatry. And our sages teach us that at that moment, Esther composed the 22nd Psalm that we say in Tehillim, in Psalms, in the book of Psalms, that begins with the words, Lamnatseach alayelet hashachar, a song to the morning star. The morning star is a star that is barely perceptible, a time when God's presence feels barely perceptible. Esther wondered, and she said these words, and these are the words in the Tehillim, in the Psalm, Kaylee, God, lama azaftani, why did you abandon me? She feels alone, but her mission doesn't stop, and she continues, and she enters Ahasuerus's room, and he extends his scepter to her, and she is accepted by him. Her life is saved, and as we read in the Megillah, she invites Ahasuerus to a feast together with Haman, his advisor. She invites him to a second feast, and at the second feast, she pleads for her life and for the life of her people. So when we read the story of Esther, the Megillah, each year anew, and perhaps more so this year than last year, but maybe we even said this last year and the year before, what we recognize is that each and every one of us is an Esther, that each and every one of us, in the most difficult of circumstances, is called upon to rise to our purpose, to fulfill the task that we were put into this world for. And that sometimes that task doesn't come surrounded by light. Exile is not a time where God's light is evident. It's a time that seems like a time of darkness. It's a time of Esther. It's a haster, aster, a time of deep concealment. Where do we find Esther in the Torah? Where do we know to find our purpose? We find our purpose in the way Torah guides our life. How do we find the strength to rise to our purpose, to meet the potential for which we were put into this world? We know this from the Torah, and we allow it to guide us and to continue, even to reach that point where our connection to God is so strong that, as Esther said, I will go to the king. Im avadati avadati. If God decides that my life will be taken, then my life will be taken. God forbid that we should need that level of self-sacrifice. But Esther teaches us how to go from being passive, from feeling like we're in a situation that we cannot fathom and cannot understand, to be able to see that where we are in the time that we live in. How many of us have said over the past few months, gosh, I don't want to be living in this kind of world. I don't want to be living through this kind of time. But here we are. God called upon Esther, and God calls upon us. This is our story of Purim. So when we read the story of Purim, Limafreya, as though it happened years ago, no, this is our story today, right now. I'm noticing that there's a question in the chat, and that is where Esther got the inspiration to fast. And I think that the answer is that it was common that in a time of difficulty, in an Eis Sarah, in a time of tragedy or a time of difficulty for our people fasted. This was not unusual. And so Esther's inspiration to fast would have come from the way we respond. Fasting is an act of tshuva, an act of repentance. If times are difficult for our nation, it is clear that this is because of something that we have done as a people. And in the case of the story of Esther, in the case of the story of Purim, when Ahasuerus invited the Jews of Shushan to participate in his feast, and they did, and they enjoyed his feast, even after Mordechai had warned them not to participate. There was an understanding. Esther understood that we had let ourselves down and distanced ourselves from God. And so fasting was a common response because a fast is an act of tshuva, an act of repentance. Where is Esther's name mentioned in the Torah? The name of Esther is in Torah in the book of Devarim, where God says that when you distance yourself from me, when you turn away from me, I will hide myself from you. And Esther's her purpose was in that time of hiddenness, in that time of concealment. In fact, our sages tell us that Esther was Hadassah, that her actual name was Hadassah, and that the name Esther was given to her. There are suggestions in among the sages that her name was a Persian name, or the name reflects the word, the morning star. Ayelet HaShachar, the morning star, is reflected in the name of Ishtar, Esther. But Esther was the name that we reflect on and the name that she was called by, because this was a time of great concealment when God said, I will hide from you, although God has also told us through the prophets that he would never leave us, that though he would be hidden, he would never leave us.
I'm wondering about the detail of, I understand that she was functioning in the time of concealment. Why then the additional detail of she felt God's presence leave her?
As she entered the room, because for the days of her fast, during those days, right, during this time of Teshuvah, which was enhanced by the fasting and the prayers of the entire nation, Esther could feel God's presence. So while she could not feel this perhaps, so when we say she felt God's presence, I think that we're not just saying that Esther felt like a Jewish woman, but that there was a sense of God's presence with her that was very intensely felt. And that when she entered this room of idolatry, our sages say that she felt like God's presence departed, because God's presence isn't present in a place of idolatry. And so she called out to God in that moment. So this level of divine presence, and I think that's what's important, is that clearly God did not leave her. Esther is successful. Ahasuerus extends his scepter to her, and she saves her people. But that level of God's presence, and perhaps this is really an important point for us, it's also in consideration of gathering and saying Tehillim, which is essentially what Mordechai had the Jewish people do, was to gather and to pray, that there's a higher or a heightened level of divine presence that can be felt, that Esther experienced. That heightened level of divine presence was what she felt left her when she entered this room full of idols.